What's up poopers, Hakarai here, and in this video I'm going to be going over my findings on the dynamic respawns that were presented to us on the last stress test. Now any one of you who logged in to play the stress test most likely will have instantly noticed that unlike previous stress tests, this time around it was much easier to tag and kill mobs in order to complete the quests in the starter zones. This is a result of something called dynamic respawns, something that is commonly used in private server launches to combat the huge amount of players they get initially. It was hinted at by one of the former Blizzard developers in the early tests of Classic Beta that dynamic respawns were always a thing in vanilla, it just simply hadn't been working correctly in the Classic Beta tests up until now. The supposed mechanic behind them was that each camp of enemies has some sort of population threshold, and whenever too many of the mobs are dead and the population gets low or zero, the respawn rates of the mobs ramp up. A blue post on the forums has now confirmed that dynamic respawns was indeed broken and not working as it should have been, and that dynamic respawns shown in the current stress test are working as intended and what we can expect when Classic launches at the end of August. According to the blue post, the dynamic respawns are set to trigger based on population thresholds of the monsters, and that they can also affect mineral nodes, creatures, herbs, etc. In addition, the post refers to spawn regions that can overlap one another, implying that the population thresholds are not always tied to a single type of enemy, but rather a region of enemies, but each can have their own overrides. With this information, I decided to experiment and gather some information on just how exactly these dynamic respawns were working and learn how to use them to their full potential. So let me walk you through my findings. Testing exactly what all of this means in 5 days is pretty impossible, but seeing the results of this dynamic respawn is pretty easy. Firstly, the regions that the dynamic respawns seem to control appear to extend outside of the initial 1 to 6 starting areas. During my test runs on the stress test, we found that after being the first people to reach the Fargo Deep Mine in Elwyn at level 4, despite no other players being around killing the kobolds, they were instantly respawning on top of us. This led me to believe that the Northshire Abbey population threshold extended outward over the entire starting section of Elwyn Forest. Or perhaps the kobold population thresholds in Northshire Abbey were somehow tied to the same kobolds in the Fargo Deep Mine, even though they were different types of kobolds. However, further into Elwyn questing, after having reached Eastvale logging camp and being the only Alliance players in the area on that layer, we found that everything was respawning in a predictable fashion. We did a full clear of the rogue wizards around the lake and found that they were respawning in the exact order we had killed them in, and there were moments where we saw that none were alive. But it did seem that the time window of all being dead was fairly short. This initially led me to believe that the first 1 to 7 questing areas are tied to more aggressive automatic respawn regions, and that the aggressiveness quickly dies off as you reach the higher level areas. I thought that another possibility that the dynamic respawns were not kicking in was because there simply wasn't enough players in the area, but on my second clear through, there were 7 players running around the lake killing the rogue wizards, and there were none alive and none were respawning, so that didn't seem to be the case. It doesn't appear to be related to the population of the players, and that also wouldn't have explained what was happening in Fargo Deep Mine anyway. Luckily, it became more clear after subsequent runs that the dynamic respawns are indeed tied to an enemy's living population versus how many are currently dead. It was possible to see upwards of 5 to 6 bear corpses on top of one another around Eastvale logging camp, but the rogue wizards didn't seem to have such an aggressive respawn timer as they were not directly tied to any quests despite dropping some quest items. But then it clicked for me that these Defias and Rogue Wizards don't just spawn around the lake, but these guys spawn all over Elwyn Forest, and perhaps because many of them were still alive in other parts of the zone, their aggressive respawn was not being triggered by us clearing out the ones at the lake. Similarly, when questing in Loch Modan to do the Trog quests, on my first layer there were only a few people killing the Trogs and not all of them were dead, and it was possible to casually clear through the camps without much difficulty. However, when I joined a group with someone on a much more populated layer and layer hopped, the camps were being constantly cleared, and as a result the Trogs were respawning on top of me very quickly and making it a lot more hectic. This more or less confirmed that dynamic respawns seems to be more aggressive when directly tied to quest-based mobs, and that it remains fairly aggressive beyond just the starting zones, extending to the 12 and 20 zones as well, and that it is related to the population of the enemies, not the population of the players nearby. This leads to the theory that 5 players could technically trigger dynamic respawns to kick in if you're killing all of the enemies in an area very quickly. However, you should immediately take note that there is a certain type of enemy that does not necessarily have a population threshold. This would be named monsters. There is only ever one of them alive, so they cannot be killed faster than their respawn timer, unless these named mobs are somehow tied to another nearby region of dynamic respawns. The named mobs in the starting zones that were tied to quests appeared to have roughly a 1 to 2 minute respawn timer, but after branching out into places like Darkshore with named mobs like Den Mother and Anaya Dawnrunner, both of them seemed to be respawning at 5 minutes on the dot. Unfortunately, when I did this testing though, there wasn't many people questing in those areas, so I couldn't confirm if killing nearby mobs would trigger their region or if they were considered individual spawns with their own overrides. So what does this all mean for those of you planning to quest in the starting areas in Classic World of Warcraft? It means that it is now possible to follow all of the leveling guides out there without much difficulty. Dynamic respawns transform every bottleneck in every zone into simply a matter of how good you are at tagging enemies. I've seen mobs respawn instantly after dying, and I've also seen 6 mobs respawning in a camp at once. So as long as you master tagging these mobs, you shouldn't have any trouble getting the ones you need to complete every quest. This also means that leveling professions early on with a lot of competition should be easy. So those of you who were planning to take mining or herbalism out of the gate will have a much easier time snagging the resource nodes, as they should respawn equally as fast as some of the early enemies. And I found this to be the case on the test, but that may have also been the fact that not many people touched the professions on the stress test. This information can also be used to plan for high gold per hour farming spots at higher levels. If a group is clearing enemies tied to quests that drop valuable items, this should trigger dynamic respawns to kick in more quickly. An example are the Furbolgs and Satyr in Felwood for those farming Timbermaw Rep or Firewater or Fellcloth. And as all those enemies are tied to quests, they should trigger dynamic respawns. We've yet to see how aggressive the dynamic respawns can get at max level though. It does unfortunately mean that it's unlikely something like Devil Swords will be affected much by it. All in all, this is pretty great news for the leveling experience and max level farming in World of Warcraft, especially in overpopulated areas, and especially with Blizzard's current server plan and layering plan. The limited number of servers we'll be getting at launch means that players will be condensed into big servers with multiple layers. And when those layers are taken away, suddenly there's a huge population of people running around. Dynamic respawns should continue to help offset this, depending on how aggressive they are in the high level farming spots. But then we've got to ask ourselves the question, if dynamic respawns is now working, do we even need layering? Many people have pointed out that with dynamic respawns in place, leveling and questing within the Zerg is still very much possible regardless of huge populations. So why do we need layering anymore? Simply put, Blizzard is still utilizing layering because it's to combat dead servers after launch. They fear for a repeat of what is going on in retail right now, where there are tons of servers that have low populations, forcing merges and cross-realm sharding. So instead, they hope to keep the number of servers to a low number and condense the players to a few servers so that when the quote-unquote tourists leave, none of the servers will be dead. So really it had nothing to do with the launch day experience to begin with. Whether what they're doing is a good idea or not, well, I've already made a video on layering, so I will not get into it here. So to summarize my findings on dynamic respawns, it appears that the population thresholds that trigger dynamic respawns seem to be tied to mob types, with the exception of the early starting enemies up to around level 6 or 7. This means that some mob types that have spawns over a large area are harder to trigger their more aggressive dynamic respawns. For example, the crabs for the Buzzbox quest in Darkshore, they spawn all up and down the coast, and more often than not, the northern crabs are never killed, so their dynamic respawns won't trigger too aggressively. but it's very easy to trigger dynamic respawns on enemies that only spawn in a condensed area, just by killing them all very quickly, such as the Grell that spawn in Bashal Arand in Darkshore. And it also seems thus far that dynamic respawn doesn't affect named mobs. Either way, dynamic respawns is really great news for solo levelers who didn't have an army of people ready to mob tag them out of the starting zones, as it puts everyone on equal footing. That means that if you are looking to level fast when Classic World of Warcraft launches, you better start practicing how to tag mobs as your class as fast as possible, be it throwing daggers, smiting, charging, fire blasting, all that good stuff. If you can master that, you will easily be able to follow any leveling guide to the T and be in for a smooth ride to 60. Anyway, that's all I wanted to talk about in this video on dynamic respawns. Let me know if you have any other questions or if you found any other information yourself about dynamic respawns to share your experience, and maybe we can get some more information on how this is all working in the comments section below. But until next time guys, I am booping out.